You're listening to In the Fast Lane. This is episode number 5 of the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix. In the Fast Lane episode 5 is presented by the team at Nash Advisory. My name is Matt Clayton, and this week we have a very, very special guest as we build up towards the 70th anniversary Grand Prix at Silverstone this Sunday. He's a man whose voice is synonymous with so much of the history of Formula One, legendary TV commentator Murray Walker. But before that, we had the first of 2 consecutive races at Silverstone last weekend with the British Grand Prix. And while we had another conversion of pole position into a victory for Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton, it was nowhere near as straightforward as that. Joining me to discuss that from safely within his 5-kilometre wide pandemic bubble in Melbourne is Michael Laminato. Hello, Michael.
Yes, I'm detecting my perimeter around. I'm going to put up some fences and no one's coming in.
Well, no one's getting out either. That's the other part of that equation. But look, Sunday's race at Silverstone, we'll look back at this win for Lewis Hamilton as one that was pretty run-of-the-mill. He was on pole position. He led every lap. He won the race. But I reckon we're about 20 seconds away from a double disaster for Mercedes after a crazy final few laps. We had punctures for Lewis Hamilton, we had puncture for his teammate Valtteri Bottas, McLaren's Carlos Sainz. It really all did kick off in those last 3 laps, didn't it?
Yeah, it was a race in which everything was going absolutely perfectly for Mercedes until it absolutely wasn't. Like you say, last 3 laps, everything seemed to start unraveling, and a little bit unusual. I think there are 2 aspects to this from the Mercedes side of things. A little bit unusual that they didn't react very quickly with Lewis, did they? They had an opportunity, brief though it was, to bring him into the pits once they saw what happened to Bottas and cover off that eventuality. I guess in the end, look, he still won the race, so, no harm, no foul, I guess. But on the other hand, in a season in which Mercedes looks so dominant, nothing can stop them, can they? Not even double tyre failure will stop this team winning races. And that's in equal parts impressive and also a little bit demoralising.
Yeah, look, for everybody else, absolutely demoralising. I think the key thing here is that Pirelli are investigating the cause of these punctures, and Hamilton was almost certain that his was caused by debris, probably from Kimi Raikkonen's Alfa Romeo after he shredded his front wing late in the race. But debris was always going to be a bit of an issue after a couple of safety cars, in addition to Kimi's problems. I think for me, the key moment in this race, as it turned out, was when Danny Kvyat crashed the AlphaTauri on lap 12 and caused a safety car. Of course, everyone dives into the pits for hard tyres to try and get to the end. The problem was the end was still 40 laps away, and Pirelli had suggested that probably a one-stop strategy was 30 to 34 laps on that hard tyre. So you add 5 or 6 laps on the end of that, and you definitely see what happened at the end, didn't you?
Yeah, and there's a certain irony, certainly from Hamilton's perspective, in that this time last year, it was him proving to everybody that a one-stop was possible, albeit I think it was more like lap 20 that he made that one-stop last year. This was markedly earlier. And this year, everyone was very committed to that one-stop. And it's a bit irritating, isn't it? Because had the safety car come a bit later, the middle part of this race probably would have been a little bit more enlivened. But it was just at that opening cusp of that pit window that meant everyone took the tyre but knew they were going to manage to the end. And for some was obviously more successful than others. Some didn't experience tyre failure, which is very good for them. But it did mean that it was a little bit follow the leader, wasn't it? In fact, that everyone was quite close at the end of the race was just because no one felt very free to push. It was all about protecting that tyre.
Well, vindicated with what happened with those few punctures that we saw. But I guess the timing of where you got your puncture is everything. I mean, Hamilton's was halfway around that final lap. Bottas had his let go as he crossed the line to start his 3rd last lap. So he had to limp around for a full lap. Pitted, finished 11th. Didn't score any points. He now falls to 30 points behind Hamilton in the title chase. It looks very much like it's going to be one Mercedes driver or the other that's going to win this championship. But I wonder if we look back at that moment as the decisive moment, perhaps in a shortened season like it is, that Hamilton really got his teeth into this championship.
It's a little bit shades of 2018, isn't it? When Valtteri Bottas came in, had quite a punchy start to the season. And then we know, for example, should have won in Azerbaijan, but had, tyre failure. It was a puncture then, a definite puncture at the end of that race, and cost him that win. Now, he wasn't about to win this race. He was close behind Hamilton, but again, there was a lot of pace management involved. And this is going to be a test for Bottas because we know he needs that confidence to really operate well. He's had a tendency in the last couple of years to put his head down a bit. He worked on that last year. It wasn't quite as bad, but still getting over that disappointment, getting over the fact he's already 30 points down is going to be massive for him. But, this could be the turning point in the season in retrospect. But I almost, I was thinking about this after the race, that the fact that it doesn't feel like a turning point is kind of worrying in itself, because at no point since that first Austrian Grand Prix, and I don't know what you would think about this, Matt, but has it felt like Lewis has been vulnerable? Like, he won this race. He was always going to win this race. Doesn't matter where Valtteri finished, because he's probably going to win the next race, Lewis, and the one after that. It kind of feels like he's in a bit of an insurmountable position.
Well, to my mind, he started to feel a bit insurmountable when he did that pole lap for the Styrian Grand Prix in the pouring rain, where he just showed that he, at his best, he is on a completely different level. But we mentioned Valtteri Bottas. It was a nailed-on 1-2 for Mercedes until Bottas's front left tyre let go. Which brings us, Michael, to Red Bull. Now, second was inherited by Max Verstappen when Bottas's tyre let go. He then pits with 2 laps to go to have a crack at setting the fastest lap. But I'm wondering, is that a decision that's cost Red Bull a win? You look at what happened to Hamilton on that final lap. Hamilton started the last lap of the race 34 seconds ahead of Max Verstappen. The margin was 5.8 seconds at the finish as Hamilton, 3 wheels on his wagon, got to the finish line. So Verstappen's time in the pits was 28 seconds for that stop that he didn't actually need to make. Now, Christian Horner said that Verstappen's own front left tyre had, quote, about 50 cuts on it, so he must have counted them very, very fast. But you do have to wonder, chasing 1 point might have cost them 7 and a win. Do you see this as a race that Red Bull lost or Mercedes won, given the circumstances of those final 2 laps?
I think there's no doubt Red Bull Racing lost this race. And I know, obviously, it's easy to say that in retrospect, because had he not stopped, obviously, once Lewis Hamilton's tyre was always going to explode, that they should have inherited that win, and it would have been a very famous victory, maybe the only one of their year, probably, by the looks of things. But I think that this also speaks to a mentality inside Red Bull Racing that I find a little bit both disappointing but also out of character, because this is normally the team that does risk everything, especially this season where there doesn't seem to be that much on the line. Okay, we don't know where they'll finish in the constructors' standings, but it seems like that car is pretty clearly second, maybe Racing Point pending, but they're not really getting the most out of that car at the moment. So it's a bit of a shame that they didn't just try it, because really, what do they have to lose in this situation? Either they win or they don't win, and they still don't win the championship either way. And it was a bit almost uncomfortable to watch Max Verstappen at the end of the race saying he was happy with second. Just doesn't seem right.
It's definitely not his modus operandi. Normally they do roll the dice in any situation like this, but what Verstappen jumping to second meant was that Charles Leclerc finished third for Ferrari, and as much as there's not a massive deal to talk about with his race, to drag that car onto the podium relative to what his teammate did in the sister Ferrari, we'll get to Sebastian Vettel in a little while, but right behind Charles Leclerc, Daniel Ricciardo matched his best result for Renault with fourth. Of course, he was fourth in Italy last year. Really, really strong race for Daniel. Started 8th, had a good start, was a bit slow on that hard tyre initially after he stopped under the safety car, but really came on late. And if you go digging through the depths of the internet, you'll find his pass on Lando Norris at Stowe right at the depth. Unbelievable pass. And standard honey badger late on the brakes from Daniel there. So inherits 2 spots with the punctures for Sainz and Bottas, but his 99th point finish, and I think more importantly, really showed the pace he has over Esteban Ocon when it mattered. He was 0.3 of a second quicker than him in Q3, beat him by 7 seconds in the race. Renault still can't seem to mention Daniel by name in a post-race press release, but a very, very, very strong weekend for Daniel, I think.
Quite a good stat, 99th points finish. I didn't know that one.
Save that one for you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It feels good to be on the show. It was a good race. It was a good race for him, and a good race for Renault, I think. A team that is still looking for, notwithstanding this weirdness about not mentioning Daniel by name, but looking for a bit of a morale boost, I think, because last year was quite chastening for that team. This year, the jury's still out about where the team sits. Obviously, they're very desperate to overcome McLaren, which is an engine customer this season, and that's absolutely the minimum if you're a manufacturer. So to be able to have that car deliver, and while Ocon hasn't really quite been on Daniel's level so far this season, bar I think the second Austrian Grand Prix, he did okay in terms of qualifying. He was close enough. He's rebuilding a bit of that confidence. That's going to be really important for Renault next year to have that continuity with Ocon. Of course, they'll have Alonso in the other car, but how that works out, as we sort of mentioned in the previous podcast, depends a bit on patience. So I think a good step forward for Renault, but very much still with something to prove. And I think this weekend's race is going to be important in that regard.
Completely agree. Running through the rest of the points finishes, Lando Norris finished 5th, which was where he started. Renault's other driver, the French driver, we mentioned him by name, Esteban Ocon, he was 6th. One of the really good drives, I think, in this race, Pierre Gasly, excellent drive to 7th, one of his stronger races, but Alex Albon in the second Red Bull finishing 8th. Bit of a messy weekend again for Albon. He had a penalty for punting Kevin Magnussen on the first lap. He qualified just 12th. He had a crash on Friday. Christian Horner's very supportive still, Michael, but he's got half the points of Verstappen after 4 races and hasn't really figured at the front since that first race in Austria. Do they have a bit of an issue there? Because at the moment, Max is kind of fighting a bit of a solo battle against those 2 Mercedes, isn't he?
He is. We have a bit of a disagreement about this, don't we?
We did.
I've got no camera on, so you can't see me pointing at you accusingly, but I am, trust me. It is. I mean, if we want, we could almost compare this to last year with Gasly, couldn't we? I mean, Gasly finished ahead of Albon in this race, for example. It's not a great look. I think some things are working in Albon's favour this season, isn't it? Is that there's no pretense that Red Bull Racing is in any championship fight. Last year, we got to the middle of the year and they were behind Ferrari for second in the standings precisely because Gasly was not scoring enough points. This year, I mean, it could prove to be a problem towards the end of the season, but it doesn't look like, over the balance of a season, Red Bull Racing's probably going to be able to get that second place. And I think the other key difference is, I mean, let's not forget, okay, Gasly was only in his second year last year as well, but Albon is this season as well, that he's showing better signs than Gasly, I think. And there's no disrespect to Gasly, but the aggression is still there. The recoveries are what is important at the end of the day because he needs to score points after a poor qualifying in a car that we can't forget looks pretty shocking to drive. I know Max makes it looks easy, but the last couple of races have really shown that car is difficult. So look, it's not what Red Bull want to see, but I think they're seeing enough progress. And I mean, that said, we do know Red Bull does turn on its drivers very quickly, so who knows what it's going to be like next week.
Of course, we're back at Silverstone next Sunday to celebrate a milestone for F1 with the 70th anniversary Grand Prix. Of course, it's a circuit where the F1 story started back in 1950 and a circuit with so much history and tradition. One man who has been trackside all around the world to see so much of that history being made over such a long career behind the microphone is this week's guest, Murray Walker. But before we get to Murray, a word from our friends at Nash Advisory. Nash Advisory are specialists in selling businesses. If you make more than $1 million in profit a year and are looking to sell your business, Nash Advisory can help you achieve the best sale price through their global network of buyers. For more, you can visit their website at nashadvisory.com.au. Nash Advisory, experts in selling your business. Joining us on this week's episode of In the Fast Lane, it is a great pleasure to introduce a man whose voice provided the signature soundtrack for Formula One, calling the action on television for the BBC and ITV. It's a very warm welcome to the one and only Murray Walker. Murray, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much.
Murray, we saw a very strange British Grand Prix, one like no other last weekend with no fans at Silverstone, where we're accustomed to seeing 100,000 plus people packing the place on British Grand Prix weekend. It's great that we're racing at all this season with everything that's going on, but from your perspective, that must have been a very, very strange sight, one you thought you'd never see, a British Grand Prix in front of empty grandstands.
Yeah, it's a sad reflection on the weird times that we live in, which I hope are going to change as soon as possible. But as ever, Silverstone did an absolutely fantastic job, and thank heavens we've got the wonder of television to watch it. But there's always the most incredible buzz at Silverstone with about 120,000 people there. It's the biggest audience in attendance for a sporting event in Britain every year. So it was certainly a very, very different race yesterday. But my goodness, while it was looking very predictable until those last few laps, the excitement of those really made up for it.
It would have been fascinating to hear the response from the fans had they been there. It would have been quite a memorable conclusion. I mean, all sport around the world is dealing with this lack of fans, and I found it interesting that drivers are now starting to remark on that absence. They're starting to feel that the fans not being there are perhaps leaving them a little bit flat, I suppose. Your commentary style, of course, is famously excitable. Could you have gotten excited, I should say, about Formula One without the crowds? What do the fans contribute to motorsport?
Yeah, I think so, because I wasn't conscious of the crowd. I was in the commentary box. I was looking at a television set, which were giving me the same picture as the viewer at home was seeing. And I was totally 110% concentrated on conveying the excitement of the occasion that was unveiling before me to the viewer. And it really didn't make any difference to me whether the crowd was there or not. Although I must in some way have been affected by having been at Silverstone for 4 days for each of the meetings and absorbing all the excitement that was going on.
I must admit, Murray, when we knew that we were going to be speaking to you for this podcast, I was trying to imagine how you would have commentated that last lap of Lewis Hamilton's when he was...
Oh, God. I would have gone absolutely bananas through the roof of the commentary box, I think, because it has to be one of the most exciting finishes of all time when you think about it. Lewis coasting home to victory, and then all of a sudden he looks as though he's coasting home to nowhere.
He's very much the man of the present, is Lewis, but I think it's interesting. You look back at, we're celebrating this 70th anniversary Grand Prix this coming Sunday. You've been part of this sport for so long, and the sport loves to look back to its past as a sort of perpetual golden age in the sport. How have you seen the progress of change in the sport over your time, particularly the past 20 or so years? Because you only have to look at the lap times these cars are doing these days and how sophisticated they are, how the sport's moved on. Do you get excited by the change, or do you think that perhaps the sport was at its peak in another era?
Well, you have to bear in mind that I'm an old codger, and I was actually at the first Grand Prix they held at Silverstone in 1948, and that was before Formula One even began, and Luigi Villoresi won in a Maserati. And in those days, of course, the engine was in front of the driver. The driver wasn't wearing any safety clothing. They used to wear a skull cap and no crash helmet. There were the medical facilities were absolutely minimal. The cars were mobile death traps. They were petrol tanks with an engine attached to them and no protection for the driver at all. And then it slowly got better and better from the safety point of view, particularly after the tragic death of Ayrton Senna at Imola in 1994, when Max Mosley, the head of motorsport worldwide, stepped in and imposed swinging safety precautions on the cars. And they're much more, infinitely more sophisticated now than they were. And it's no less exciting from my point of view.
I thought it was interesting this week, thinking about some of the past races at Silverstone, that Carlos Sainz noted that they're going faster than ever around that circuit, yet somehow they seem slower. Somehow the spectacle doesn't seem as exciting as perhaps it once was. And I guess that's always going to be subjective. But why do you think that is for some people, that Formula One, I don't necessarily say doesn't match up to what they have in their minds, but maybe isn't expressing itself as well as it used to?
Well, I think a lot of it is looking backward through rose-coloured glasses. It's still mighty exciting when you take into account what a contest it is with man and machine. But I have to admit that for me, the 70s and 80s were the most exciting time. But then I was very much more involved with it at the time, because I was literally a part of it and having to communicate to the public worldwide what was going on. And it was very exciting times when people like Jackie Stewart were driving, and we got the most incredible races at Silverstone, with Nigel Mansell beating Piquet, for instance, and various others. I could go on for ages about it, but I know you won't have the time.
Murray, I did want to ask you about Lewis Hamilton. You mentioned success at Silverstone, and he's certainly had plenty of that. It's remarkable to think that he's now only 4 victories away from Michael Schumacher's record of 91 Grand Prix victories, and he could equal his 7 World Championships this year. Where does Lewis stand for you compared to Schumacher and some of the all-time greats in the sport?
Well, people say to me, who's the greatest? And I always say, look, I think it's impossible to say because the drivers and the circuits and the cars were different. You can say who's the best of his generation, like Schumacher was the best of his generation, and Senna and various other people, but there's no common yardstick that you can measure all the Formula One Grand Prix drivers over the years against. So it's entirely subjective who one thinks is the greatest. For me, the greatest of all time is a chap called Tazio Nuvolari, who was an Italian before World War II. And when I mention his name, people look blankly at me because they don't, understandably, they've never heard of him. But Fangio took a lot of beating, Jim Clark, Jackie Stewart. There again, could go on, but which was the best, I really don't know. I used to say Fangio. I think I'm going to have to say very shortly Lewis Hamilton, because if you look at it in terms of statistics, he's already got more poles than Michael Schumacher. He's got at least 3 years in him if he doesn't hurt himself or leave Mercedes for some reason, or they decide to stop, in which case he's got at least another 3 championships ahead of him. So statistically, he will become the greatest. But he's also, in my opinion, and this is very contentious indeed, he's better than either Schumacher or Senna, because both of them, Schumacher and Senna, adopted at various times in their career highly debatable driving tactics, like Schumacher stopping deliberately at Monaco to prevent Prost getting pole position, like Schumacher colliding with Villeneuve at Jerez in 1997, like Senna with Prost in 1990 at Japan. And Lewis Hamilton has never been anything like that. He's always driven as clean as a whistle. He's an extremely nice, gigantically talented driver, and I don't think we've ever seen anybody like it before.
It certainly feels like this is an era we're living in, a Hamilton era, I suppose, but inseparable from that is probably Mercedes. For as much as Hamilton is now breaking Schumacher's records, Mercedes is breaking the records set by Ferrari in the 2000s at the turn of the century. I mean, you saw the build up to Ferrari creating that streak of dominance and saw it in its pomp, really. What made Ferrari so successful then, and do you see some parallels in Mercedes today? And is this the greatest Formula One team, this Mercedes team in the sport?
What made Ferrari great in Schumacher's time was a combination of men of different nationalities who all pulled together, like Ross Brawn, who looked after the technical side of things, like Rory Byrne, who designed the cars, like Piero Martinelli, who did the engines, and of course like Jean Todt, and he was the team boss, and he kept Luca di Montezemolo, the boss of Ferrari, off the backs of all the others in terms of Italian politics, which are always rife at Ferrari. You have to remember that Ferrari gets a double-page spread and in the Italian newspapers virtually every day. They're the next most important thing to the Pope, I should think. So that's what made Ferrari so dominant then. That doesn't apply anymore. It's a different situation altogether. They clearly have not got the right people in all the right places, which is why Binotto, the current Ferrari team manager, is doing a reshuffle. But reshuffles always take time to take effect. So sadly, I'm not expecting Ferrari to be competitive before 2022.
Murray, I did want to ask you about your experiences with Australia, because you came down here for the World Championship at 2 very different times of the year. You had the experience of Adelaide being the season finale and the last day of school term and a couple of championship deciders. And then obviously once the race moved to Melbourne, you had all that anticipation for the start of the season. You had so many of the sport's biggest drivers debut in Melbourne. Compare for us the feeling of travelling for those two races and those two cities, because there was a definite different vibe to Adelaide back in its heyday than there has been to Melbourne for the past 25 years, but both have been very successful stops on the F1 calendar, haven't they?
Yeah, well, you are now think I'm a sycophantic creep, which I will try not to be. But I have to make it clear that I absolutely adore Australia. I had never been there before 1985, understandably, and I probably wouldn't have been there ever if it hadn't been for the Grand Prix. So when we first went out to Adelaide, it was like a breath of fresh air to me. I loved the Australian way of doing things, the food, the laid-back attitude, the enthusiasm, and we loved being in Adelaide. It was an ideal place. But then Australia decided it was going to Melbourne, and we weren't best pleased about that, to be quite honest, because we'd never been to Melbourne. But when we got there, we found it was just as good as Adelaide, but in a different way altogether. But either place, from Formula One's point of view, was wonderful. And I loved it when Australia started the season, because we'd got everything to look forward to thereafter. The one drawback was that we were starting off with the best race of the year, with the possible exception of Silverstone, and it was going to go downhill in terms of excitement and interest afterwards. But whatever, Australia has been great for Formula One and for me.
Some kind words there, certainly. It's not just in terms of circuits that I suppose Australia's been able to have a bit of a say in Formula One. Of course, we've got a fair few drivers who have made their way up the ranks, some tasting ultimate success, Brabham and Jones, and of course, more recently, Webber and Ricardo. From your perspective, I suppose, from what you've seen and gleaned from these characters, is there a uniting theme among Australians who make it to Formula One? What is it that bring them to the pinnacle?
Well, they're mighty tough, talented, ambitious and determined people, because you've got to come from one side of the world to the other as somebody who is probably at a not particularly advanced stage of his motor racing career, and put up with all the inconveniences and the differences between Australia and Britain and the continent and the rest of the world. So you look at, there was nobody more determined than Jack Brabham. Alan Jones, I could go on about until the cows come home. Mark Webber is a lovely bloke, and he's doing just as well with commentary on television here as he did in the Red Bull driving seat when he was driving for them. And Formula One has really welcomed Australian drivers, and they've made an enormous contribution to the sport.
Murray, your career has always been linked to Formula One, but your background before that was very much motorbikes, and I think a lot of people may not be aware that your own father, Graham, was a very accomplished motorcycle racer in his day and was a journalist and a broadcaster. Two Wheels was where you first got your commentary feet wet, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. When I came out, I was in a tank regiment during World War II, and when I came out, I thought, now I'll show the old man how a motorcycle really ought to be ridden. And I started racing bikes, and I very rapidly discovered that I wasn't going to be showing the old man how the motorcycle ought to be ridden, because he knew and I wasn't nearly good enough. And so you know what they say, those that can do, and those that can't talk about it. So I started talking about it. I had a bit of a competition career because I won a gold medal in the International Six-Stage Trial in 1949, and I rode in the Southern Experts in 1949. But I was good club standard, but I was never going to make a good living out of it as my dad did. I've got a feeling I'm not answering your question, am I?
Well, your father, he's an Isle of Man TT winner. There's serious pedigree in what he did as a sports person, isn't there?
Yeah, I had an absolutely wonderful couple of parents, my father and mother. My dad, as you rightly pointed out, was a gigantically accomplished racer. He won the TT in the Isle of Man. It's not generally known. They actually won the first international motorcycle road race on the Nürburgring in 1928 or 29. And he won the Ulster Grand Prix, won most of the continental races, and he would have been very high up in the World Championships if there had been a World Championship situation then, which there wasn't. But then he took up broadcasting, and when I singularly failed to match his ability, I got an audition with the BBC at Goodwood, and in a car race, not a motorcycle race, because I've never made any secret of the fact that motorcycles always have been and still are my first love. But I got an audition at Goodwood for a car meeting, which went well. As a result of that, I did the TT in the Isle of Man with my father. And from 1949 until 1962, when he sadly died, we were the BBC's only father and son commentary team ever, and I think we still are. And then when Dad died, I took his place at the grandstand at the TT and all the other motorcycle stuff he did. And putting Silverstone back in the picture again, I did the commentary on that never-to-be-forgotten battle between Barry Sheen on the Suzuki and Kenny Roberts on the Yamaha at the Motorcycle British Grand Prix at Silverstone. And they battled together in front of Will Hartog, the Dutch rider, for the whole race, passing and repassing. And at one point in the race, Barry passed Kenny Roberts, put his left hand behind his back, and gave Kenny Roberts the V sign. And I said, "Oh look, he's telling Kenny he's second." Yeah, motorcycles. I did motocross, which is called scrambling in those days. People like Jeff Smith, Arthur Lambkin, Dave Vickers, for years and years on television, and it's gigantically exciting stuff, which unfortunately isn't on the box these days, and I think it's a great pity.
Fortunately, Murray, so much of this motorsport history resides with several people, but of course with yourself, having been, certainly from a Formula One perspective, around from the very beginning. And of course this week we're celebrating the 70th anniversary of the World Championship. This might be a bit of a big question to condense down into only one answer, but having seen and called and been involved with so much of Formula One's history, if there was a single moment you could relive, revisit, see again with fresh eyes, I suppose, with your experience, is there one you could pick?
Yes, there are so many, but since you're putting my back to the wall and I've got to pick one, I would say my old mate Nigel Mansell with the battle against Nelson Piquet in I'm terrible at remembering years, 86 or 87, at Silverstone, when Nigel had a wheel balance problem and had to come in and change wheels and rejoin the race a long way behind his teammate Nelson Piquet, who he absolutely loathed. It was a mutual disgust situation between the two of them. And Nigel, and then there was a gigantic British crowd there, of course, and Nigel closed down on Nelson Piquet and caught and passed him with a dummy at the end of the race. Won the race. The British crowd went balmy and invaded the course. And being a well-mannered British crowd, they all went back to where they'd come from when Nigel went back to the start, which wouldn't have happened at every Grand Prix venue. And I suppose that has to be my outstanding memory. But there are, I mean, like I said earlier on, I could go on for ages about Silverstone and my association with it. And another very good race was, just trying to remember the year, 69, Jack Brabham and Rindt, and so on. But I'm sure you haven't got time to hear all this. I've forgotten to tell you about the two things that I'm proudest and pleased about with my association with Silverstone. One is that I'm a very proud member of the British Racing Drivers Club, who own and operate the place. And the other thing is that I've actually had 2 Formula One experiences at Silverstone because I drove a Formula One McLaren in Nicky Lauda's day. It was round about 1976, I think. I drove a McLaren round the Grand Prix circuit at Silverstone for about 6 laps. And even more exciting than that, I did 2 sessions with Martin Brundle in the 2-seater Formula One McLaren in 1999, and we were doing 190 miles an hour down the Hangar Straight. And Brundle said to me when I got in the car, we had intercom in the car, and he said to me, "You'll think I've missed my braking points, but I won't have." And so we were zooming up towards Abbey at Silverstone at an enormous velocity and not getting any slower, and the engine was roaring away behind me. And I remember thinking, well, I've had a good life. But Martin hit the brakes, and of course the braking systems on Formula One cars are quite incredible, and we rolled round Abbey and accelerated out. But it was an amazing experience.
Murray, that circuit's played such an enormous role in your career, and obviously with the history of Formula One, and we've got this 70th anniversary race this coming Sunday. Very much looking forward to that. It's been great to take a trip down memory lane with you. Stay well and stay safe over there. Enjoy the rest of the season, and thanks so much for joining us on this week's podcast.
Very great pleasure. Good luck.
That's all for this episode of In the Fast Lane. Thanks for joining us, and a big thanks to this week's guest, Murray Walker. We'll be back next week to wrap up Sunday's race at Silverstone and to look at what happened in round 3 of the MotoGP season in the Czech Republic. And we'll also be joined by another big name guest from the world of motorsport. Until then, for Michael Laminato, I'm Matt Clayton. Join us next time for another lap in the Fast Lane.